So, good morning. Welcome to the Sports Science Congress 2021. Today, our keynote speaker concerning the neuromuscular function symposium is Professor Anthony Blazevich. Professor Anthony Blazevich is a professor of biomechanics in the School of Medical and Health Science and director of the Center of Exercise and Sports Science Research. His roles include teaching on biomechanics, neurophysiology, and other units, as well leading research in areas such as sports biomechanics, neurophysiology, and strength conditioning. Today, Professor Anthony Blazevich will present his talk with the title Strength Training to Improve Movement Velocity, Specificity of Adaptation versus Specificity of Training. So it's a big pleasure for us to have you here. It's a big pleasure also for me to moderate this session. So I look forward for your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Sandro, and good day to everyone. It's nighttime here in Australia, so I hope you've got a beautiful sunny day outside, in which case I hope you can get back to that very, very soon. It's great to be talking on a topic that I really enjoy, which is strength training, power training, and velocity training. And what I want to do today is maybe look at how the mechanism by which we move and the adaptations we evoke from resistance training and speed training might help us move faster. So I'm going to focus on, running or throwing or these sorts of things. And maybe afterwards we can have some questions about specific sports. But the idea is to try and think about the detail of the human body, the physics and the biomechanics behind it, and think about how that might get us to look very differently at how to train our athletes. So, of course, it makes sense that if you want to accelerate anything, the athlete, an implement that they're throwing, or an opponent, you need to produce a force. And I have to remind you all that the best way to learn to develop very fast forces so that you can move rapidly is to practice moving fast. So let's be clear here that sport-specific high-speed training is clearly the most important training your athletes will ever do. But in this age of, force velocity profiling and the idea that if you need to improve very high velocity movement potential, the best way to train is fast because of a specificity of training, I really want to get you to think outside the box at how all different types of training, including training very slowly under high loads, can help your ability to move fast. So the first thing we want to look at, of course, is the muscles, because the muscles, we think, assumedly, produce the power for movement. And you already know that if we need to develop forces very rapidly, we use our nervous system to turn the muscle on, and the muscle will then take a little bit of time to generate its force. So if we generate force, the force rises over time to reach its peak. And if we've known for a very, very long time that if we do heavy resistance training, very heavy strength training, we get stronger. But that also means that if you can develop your force in the same time as before training, so you don't necessarily get faster, you just get stronger. Actually, you can generate more force at all these earlier time points as well. So even very short duration activities can benefit from just getting stronger. And that means that even below 200 milliseconds of force time could be beneficial. And to put that into context, here is a force trace from a vertical jump. So if you were just to do a counter movement vertical jump, the force goes down as you dip, and then you produce a big propulsive force to stop yourself and eventually jump up. And this whole force production phase, by the way, we start producing force halfway down, approximately halfway down this period here. I know in a lot of research they'll show it here or here, and that's actually wrong. It's somewhere around here, I promise. Usually the force production time in a maximal vertical jump is 600 milliseconds. So if just doing traditional training, you're improving even within 200 milliseconds, you can probably immediately see that maybe slow heavyweight training could be of some benefit. But more recent studies, although this one's nearly 20 years old, show not only can you increase your peak force, but if you do the right type of heavyweight training, so really attempting to lift heavy and fast, you can improve even the early rate of force development here. Okay, and that's really useful in the majority of sports. If you review all of the rate of force development literature and try and look for the types of training that are really useful for switching on the muscles and developing fast force, you come up with this finding that there is a movement pattern specificity. So that means that if we know that we want to develop fast force, we have to try to practice using the task in our sport. But if we're not going to do it there, if we're going to do it in the gym, then it's almost certain we're going to have to replicate those movement patterns as best we can. Because when it comes to rate of force development, movement pattern specificity is key. If you do a squat lift in training and then try and do a one-legged hop as your test, you'll see very little transfer for rate of force development. But in addition to that, probably the key is the intent to move as fast as you can. So even if you're lifting really heavy in the gym, if you attempt to lift it fast, we see massive improvements in rate of force development. And ultimately, that's also a key. Much less important, although that's interesting because a lot of people think it's primarily important, is velocity specificity. Because of course, we can improve rate of force development even by practicing isometrically, which of course is not velocity specific to many tasks at all. But there is some evidence that there's a better transfer between movement patterns if you're moving fast. So doing jump squats and doing plyometrics, for example, could give you a broader rate of force development improvement. Either way, if you attempt to move fast and you practice moving very, very fast, there are some specific changes that happen in your nervous system. In this study here, published quite a long time ago, and it's been repeated several times recently, subjects were asked to develop a force as fast as they can. Actually, this was in their shin muscle, their tibialis anterior, at the front of their lower leg. And what they did was put electrodes into the muscle to see when specific motor units or muscle fibers were firing. And at the onset of force development, you can see that they've captured a muscle fiber or a motor unit firing, and they've put a little asterisk, a little star above it, where they've found the same motor unit firing. You can see the shape looks identical. So have a think about, for it to fire 4 times took a certain amount of time. And then 12 weeks of practicing, so training for high velocity force application. If you find not the same motor unit, because that's nearly impossible, but find a similar type of motor unit and then track how often it fires, notice it fires many times in a much shorter time period compared to before training. So what we've known for a long time is that when you attempt or practice moving fast, your brain sends faster neural signals to your muscle. And that releases more calcium and you develop much bigger forces faster. And this seems to be a critical factor influencing your ability to develop rapid force. So regardless of whether you're lifting heavy in the gym or doing specific task practice, if you're spending time practicing fast force production, your nervous system will let you get better at it. But of course, you all know that, we have these fast twitch and slow twitch fibers, and fast twitch fibers, of course, have much faster rates of force development. So muscles with lots of fast twitch fibers, here shown as the myosin heavy chain 2, also develop their tension or their force much faster. The other way around is to look at slow muscles that take longer. So higher here means they take longer. Down here, faster twitch, take less time to develop force. So we know fiber type matters. So maybe what we should also look at is how training affects fiber type. And you've probably known for a long time that sprint training, I wouldn't call this sprint training because I'm a pure sprinter. This is 30-second cycle sprints. That's really tiring for me, but for most people, they still call this sprint training. And after 6 weeks, you can see that the fast twitch A fibers have increased in their proportion. Maybe a small shift in the fast twitch B, and maybe that comes because of a slight loss of type 1 fibers. And this is a repeatable finding that sprint training with good rest periods can help you shift a little bit your fiber type towards these faster fibers. And we see something similar here after plyometrics training. Again, these 2A fibers increasing. I will just sort of remind you that sometimes when you do this training, it can also decrease some of the very faster fibers. And that means that you're going to fatigue less. which is important even if you're just running 60 or 100 meters. So it's not that everything becomes super, super fast. It can be that there's a slight change to be faster, but certainly these faster but less fatigable fibers. But instead of just shifting our fiber type, which we can only do a small amount relative to our genetics, we could also make just the fast twitch fibers bigger, because then they generate more force. And to see proof of that, we can look a long, long time ago back to K.O. Häkkinen's oldest studies back in 1985, where very heavy strength training in the first 12 months tended to increase the size of the fast twitch fibers much more than those slow twitch fibers. And since then, we've seen multiple studies showing that these short blocks of between 3 and sort of 6 or 8 weeks of heavyweight training can selectively hypertrophy the fast twitch fibers. They're very amenable to it. And we see some of this evidence, for example, too, that if you shift your fiber type towards the faster ends by making those fast twitch fibers bigger, then the time it takes to develop force comes down. And if you keep slower fibers because you're not getting that fast twitch hypertrophy, it can still take longer. Okay, so we can make the fibers more fast twitch or make the fast twitch bigger, but you know what? You can also change each fiber. So even your slow twitch fibers can become fast. Here's one great example in plyometrics training, and here is the standard sort of force velocity relationship where they applied a load to these fibers. They took these out of humans. So this is humans doing plyometric training. They take the muscle biopsy, grab a piece of fiber, and they put different loads on the fiber, and they measure how fast it can go. And so with very low loads, you get these high speeds. And what's very hard to see here is that from before training, well, it's about here, to after training, about here, there's quite a big change in the unloaded shortening speed. So at very low loads, the plyometrics training caused this fiber to shorten much faster. And it's a type 1, a slow twitch fiber. And this also improves power. This is the power curve, force times velocity. And you can see power goes up. And a fair bit of that upness is below at low loads, high velocities. But of course, there's also an improvement in peak force. That's when velocity is 0. And if you look at each fiber type, the 2A and the 2AX, they didn't have any 2B or 2X completely, you see the same thing, that plyometrics training can improve the power output even of your slowest twitch fibers. But what's also interesting, is that you don't have to just train fast like plyometrics to get these types of changes. Luckily, these authors gave us very similar graphs to look at. So hopefully these will now make some sense. This is after very heavy strength training. And again, they put a load on the fiber and measure its speed. And what's hard to see, I know, is that after strength training, from pre to post, there's almost no improvement in the velocity, the peak velocity. But there is a big change in force. And that's the same for each fiber type, and particularly the type 1, which means when you look at power, there is still this nice big increase in power. The difference is that notice the power here improves mostly right above in the same sort of velocity band, whereas after strength training, it shifts just a little bit from here across a little bit, from here across a little bit. So in other words, the fibers get more powerful, but it's shifted towards heavier load. So what these type of data show us is that even your fibers that you've got, even if you don't make them bigger and you don't shift them, they can change their own characteristics. Plyometrics training and heavy weight training will improve their power, but the plyometrics and other type of speed training will bias them towards fast velocity, whereas the heavy strength training will bias them towards force production. Of course, there are some sexy things you might look at. You may have heard that if you do fast eccentric training, it can do really cool things for fiber type. This looks at the shift in fiber type with slow eccentric training, this time of the arm flexor muscles. And you can see that the type 1s go from about 57 down to about 50. So they're losing some slow twitch, and these type 2A go from 34 to 41. So they're gaining some fast twitch, but there's no real change in the fastest, the 2Bs. But in this study, if they did fast eccentric training, so very high speeds of eccentric lengthening in the biceps, you saw an even bigger loss of type 1. Look, 50, nearly 54 down to 39, a big shift. Type 2A, 40 up to 48, so a nice shift. But also look at the type 2B. They went from fewer than 6% 2B up to nearly 13% 2B. And so this suggested that maybe very brief, rapid eccentric contractions might be unique in their ability to give you very fast fibers. I have to caution you though, these results are not easily repeatable. These aren't shown with lots of different types of training, although sometimes there's evidence of it. This was done on an isokinetic dynamometer, not in the gym using normal weights. So a bit more to learn about this, but there may be some crazy cool things out there. Now, one thing a lot of these training types have in common is that they give you an intense burst of activity and then rest. You're not meant to understand or read this slide. It's there for those of you who really know your physiology and want to go and read a paper about it. But it reminds us that if we fatigue ourselves, if we do a lot of work, we switch on a whole bunch of signaling inside our muscle fibers that actually causes us to get slower. It makes slow twitch fibers, okay? And that means if we don't want that, then you try not to fatigue your athletes too much in their sessions. You only do that when your primary outcome is to get them fitter. But that doesn't mean that endurance training can't improve muscle power. And there are a number of studies that I don't have time to show you, but I'll just give you some hints from this research by Scott Trapp, who's done a lot on this. And these are endurance runners who do a lot of running, and they compared recreational runners in the dark to highly trained runners in the white. And you can see that the fibers are much bigger. There's more hypertrophy in the vastus lateralis, in the thigh muscles of distance runners. Not only that, but if you look at the power output, there's more power. And this isn't because they did weight training or plyometrics training. These are just highly trained runners. And even these slow twitch fibers become more powerful with prolonged endurance running. And this has been shown in elite cyclists, masters, athletes, and everything else, that if you do very many years of endurance activity, even your slow twitch fibers can become more powerful. So it's not the case that if you just do lots and lots of endurance, you should get necessarily slow. But of course, it does make it harder to get hypertrophy and does make it harder to shift your fiber type. So there's a balance that you're going to have to reach if you're training yourself or your athletes. But if I'm summarizing, I would say that heavy strength training can still be used to increase the total quantity of my fast tissue, because I can shift some fiber type and I can get hypertrophy of those fast twitch fibers. Of course, if I really want to move fast, it's likely that I have to combine it with much faster training, such as normal sprint or speed training, as well as plyometrics and other things, because that seems to give us the best fast twitch fiber adaptation. So as a coach or an athlete or someone else, you may have to then periodize and program appropriately, depending on how good your athlete is right now and what you're trying to achieve. And you'll have to strike that balance for yourself. But of course, we always sort of think of sports science as muscles and fiber types, but it's far more than that. There are lots of other adaptations that are important. If we really want to move fast, if we want the muscles to shorten very rapidly, we need to understand how they shorten rapidly. This is an ultrasound image, which you may have seen these types of things before. We've had an ultrasound probe on top of the muscle, and when the sound waves go into the muscle through the fat layer, they'll hit a muscle like this. This is the vastus lateralis, the big thigh muscle. And these white lines show us the direction of our muscle fibers, or at least the bundles, the fascicles. And that's the sound waves bouncing off all the fatty tissues and connective tissues so we can see them. And then you can see another muscle down here, and it has angles a different way. And this is vastus intermedius, for those of you who know their anatomy. And down here is the big thigh bone, the femur. And what you'll see is that these fibers, or these fascicles, attach at an angle to a very, very big, thick piece of connective tissue, which, if it kept going, would become your tendon. So your tendon is up here and your muscle is going to pull your tendon. And when the muscle is activated by your nervous system, it shortens and lengthens, shortens and lengthens. And what you'll notice is that these fibers don't just shorten and lengthen, they rotate. They're pulling like the oar in rowing, right? And they're helping each other. They're working as synergists or best friends, pulling this central bit here that will become the tendon. And this rowing stroke, this rotation of the fiber, we think is absolutely essential for power output, because if the fiber itself or the fascicles themselves shorten a certain amount in a certain time, but then they also rotate, they're going to pull the tendon, they're going to pull the end of the muscle much more. So the overall shortening of the muscle is much greater than just the shortening of the fiber, because the fiber is also rotating and helping to pull it. That also means that the speed of the muscle is much greater than the speed of the fascicle. This is just like if you were to ride your bike or a car, or drive your car down a hill where you want to go very fast, you put it in a high gear so that there's lots of wheel movement, that is, lots of muscle shortening, for a given amount of engine movement or axle movement, that is, fascicle. So muscle tries to work in a high gear to give you more speed. So if this cool method helps us move faster, how do we get the fibers to rotate more? Well, we have some hints. One hint that comes from animal research shows us that the fascicle angle, how much pennation a muscle have, might matter. Not only because it increases what's called the physiological cross-sectional area of the muscle, that is basically how big it is and how much force it can produce, but because increasing that fascicle angle, the pennation, seems to increase the gear that our muscle works at. That is, the muscle will shorten faster for a given fascicle speed. And remember, strength training is the #1 way we know to increase a muscle's fascicle angle, because as we hypertrophy the muscle, the fascicle angles tend to go up with training over those weeks or months. So if we do heavy type strength training to increase the fascicle angle, we might expect more rotation and therefore more velocity in our muscle. But those fibers also attach onto a very stiff or thick connective tissue. It's called the aponeurosis. It's really the tendon that goes into your muscle. And as the tendon goes into the muscle, the fibers attach to that. And we know from animal research, again, that if you damage the aponeurosis, if you damage the connective tissue that the fibers insert onto, it may have no effect on how much rotation occurs in a low force contraction, that is, have no effect on the gear. But if you start to load the muscle harder and harder, like if you're doing weightlifting or if you're trying to do a vertical jump where there's a lot of load, you're moving your whole body, as the load gets to high forces, the more you damage or the more you affect that aponeurosis, the lower is the gear, meaning you don't get the speeds that you would like to have. So our connective tissues play a key role in the ability for fibers to rotate. That is, the ability for your muscle to shorten quickly. And I won't give you lots of evidence and lots of data because it gets too confusing, but just to be aware that the current state of research shows that strength training can increase both the thickness and the width of these aponeuroses, these big, thick connective tissues within the muscle. So this is an MRI scan of your thigh. Here's your thigh bone, your femur, and this is your big vastus lateralis, the big thigh muscle on the outside of your thigh. And with training, this aponeurosis tends to get wider and also thicker. Now, there's another thing that we think affects this rotation. And that is that the rotation requires your muscle cells, your fibers, to have a lot of water, a lot of fluid pressure. Because if you have a very light load on your muscle, it's very easy for the fibers to rotate. But if you have a very heavy load, the fibers can't rotate very well. Now, in order to shorten, the fibers have to get fatter because they stay the same volume. So if they can't rotate upwards, if they can't bulge upwards, which way do they bulge? Outwards. They bulge in the wrong direction. So it means that instead of the muscle rotating upwards, all the fibers flatten out and the muscle kind of squashes under the load and it can't rotate. Actually, this isn't so bad for force production because the fibers stay more in line with the fibers. So this flattening under heavy loads that doesn't allow rotation, in other words, you work in a low gear, is good for force. A bit like a truck trying to go up a hill, you go into low gear to get the force. But if you want to move fast and work in a high gear, you need your fibers to stay like this. And we think that by giving lots of water and fluid pressure into the cells, we can get that. So how do we get fluid pressure? How do you get lots of water and lots of pressure into your muscle fibers? Well, the two ways we know of are warm-up, because warm-up drives lots of water into the muscle, and strength training or other forms of training that lead to hypertrophy, because a lot of the size increase is fluid type content. So at least theoretically, every time you warm up and as your muscles get bigger with strength training, we should be able to resist the flattening of these heavy loads and keep the rotation of fibers to help us move faster. You know what? There's even one more way that we can get more rotation, as far as we know, and that is to stiffen the connective tissues around the fibers themselves. Here is a micrograph of the wrapping around a single muscle fiber. And when those muscle fibers form bundles called fascicles, you can see that there's another layer of connective tissue. So here's all the individual muscle fibers, and there's a big lot of tissue that wraps them up. All of these connective tissues are very, very, very important to your ability to develop force. And we believe they're very important to fiber rotation. Okay. And the way we believe to get this, the best training we know to affect this sort of outside the cell, the extracellular matrix, is strength training. Heavy strength training is really important. And to the best of our knowledge, maybe this is one benefit of eccentric training, both for injury and performance, is that it seems to have great effects on the extracellular matrix. For those of you who absolutely love their physiology, or in a uni student or a university lecturer, I can drive you to the Hildal studies, where he shows that the genes associated with building more collagen, for example, are very, very amenable to eccentric training. So there appears to be a specificity of adaptation where strength training can give us bigger fascicle angles, bigger fibers with more water in them. They can stretch and thicken that aponeurosis that the fibers insert onto, and even stiffen all of our connective tissues in our muscles. And all of this should significantly affect the gear that your muscle works at. That is, how much rotation occurs. Of course, if you ever meet everyone who tells you they know how to train athletes and they know how everything works, you know to walk in the other direction. Because as cool as all this sounds, we absolutely know nothing about it. No one has ever done strength training or plyometrics training or any form of training in humans and measured the rotation of fibers during contractions. We don't know whether it affects the gearing, and we don't know which effect is most prominent, the pennation angle or the connective tissues or any of it. So at this stage, it looks like it's something for the future. So what I can tell you, though, is that we hypothesize. We do believe that one of the big benefits of heavyweight training and eccentric training is that it may allow you to rotate your fibers more. And that could be a really cool thing. Okay. But we can produce all the forces we like. But if we don't transfer the force effectively, we're in trouble. Because when we're in the sporting arena, we're doing very complicated movements when we've got multiple links in our chain. So we've got a moving chain of our body. That's called the kinetic chain, of course. Now, you know already that your technique is absolutely vital. Maintaining perfect technique is an absolute key to elite sports performance. And that's why sports practice is so important. But if you look at the most elite people dealing with massive forces, any excuse to watch Jonathan Edwards, I can't believe that someone can do these jumps on one leg with such force and look so effortless. Every other triple jumper in the history of the world has vibrations and the body going all over the place, and he just looks so efficient. It's remarkable. But if you take a video and look very close up, it doesn't look so perfect. Remember, for Jonathan Edwards to jump into the air, he needs to produce a big force against the ground, And the ground produces a reaction force, an equal and opposite force back at him. And this lifts him into the air. But not just him, not just his center of gravity. If he wants to lift his arm as well, that force needs to get to his arm. And the only way to get to the arm is to go through the lower leg, the upper leg, the pelvis, the whole body, and then to the arm, because the arm is attached to the body. And so is the other arm, and so is his head, and so is the other leg. So forces have to be transmitted through the body for every part of the body to get into the air. And on the other side, the foot lands a little bit to the side of the midline, which causes rotations in his body as well. Now, if he doesn't control them, then the force will transfer poorly. And there's a lot of energy just going into the rotation of the body segments. In other words, energy is lost because it's not moving someone forward, it's moving them in every other direction. What we obviously want is for the force to be transferred, efficiently, so that the force loss is minimal. So if you start to see these sorts of, events, we know we're in trouble. That means energy loss. I just want to remind you, because we don't have time to go through the whole body, that the body is really complicated. Take your spine. Your spine has 24 joints in it that you have to control. And it has a huge number of very small muscles that sometimes span just one joint each. And you have to control all of them. In order to control the force going through you, you need a lot of practice. But of course, that's not just sports practice. That can be putting a heavy load on yourself and jumping around all over the place. In other words, plyometrics training and heavy strength training. So what I would call core training, I know everyone a lot of people hate the word core training, but that's because to train all this sort of axial muscles, you have to give it some sort of perturbation and then ask it to keep control, and practice makes perfect. But there is another muscle that we often forget about, and it's the muscle that helps us breathe every day. It's our diaphragm. The diaphragm, when it contracts, pushes upwards into your lungs and increases the pressure to help support the spine. And if you've ever wondered whether this is true or just something you read in magazines, you might enjoy this study back in 2005 by Simon Gandivia's group over in Sydney. And what they did was a very fun experiment where they pushed a hammer into people's spine, into their lumbar spine, and tried to measure how far they could push the spine. And then instead of asking people to activate their own diaphragm, to breathe in, they stimulated with an electrical current right in here near the base of the neck in the phrenic nerve. And so every time they stimulated it, they'd get a big diaphragm contraction. And what they then did was they pushed into the spine with and without the diaphragm contraction. And what you can see is something like this, that if you increase the force, you can push the spine further. So you get something like this. The higher the force, the more the spine is depressed. But if you stimulate the phrenic nerve and activate the diaphragm, you can see that you need more and more force to move the spine the same amount. In other words, the spine is stiffer when your diaphragm is activated. So it's not just all the normal muscles that you have to control, it's also your diaphragm. And keeping your diaphragm strong and fit so it doesn't fatigue is a real key. Inspiratory muscle fatigue is a big problem for performance loss. How do we get big, strong diaphragms? Well, you can actually do specific inspiratory muscle training with breathing devices. I'll let you look that up yourself, because what I want to show you here is that even your heavy strength training, even that bodybuilding sexy stuff that a lot of athletes who shouldn't be doing it do in the gym, weightlifters have thicker diaphragms than most people. And this is probably because the diaphragm force, the diaphragmatic pressure, is high, even in things like an arm curl. Good news for those who love their biceps. Bench press, there are actually multiple reasons why bench press can be good, and this is one of them. We can get big diaphragm pressures if you know how to activate during the bench press. And this power lift is actually like I guess it's like a clean. It's like a clean up to waist height. Big diaphragmatic pressures. I just want to remind you though, there is a specificity. You don't have to really know what this slide is telling you, except for the fact that these different muscles all around our abdominal regions have different amounts of electrical activity, depending on whether you ask someone to flex or extend in their back or abdomen, whilst they're contracting to generate that intra-abdominal pressure. So it means that we can really get a big, strong diaphragm and strengthen those muscles with normal weight training, but maybe we still have to think about specificity of training. So strength training, as well as lots of task-specific training, can increase the strength or the stiffness of all of our stabilizing muscles. I've particularly focused here on intra-abdominal pressure because it's really interesting, but remember, we need it for lots and lots of different movements. We've got scapular around the shoulder, and we've got the pelvis and the hip muscles and all these other things. And so whether you're in the gym and you choose to try to emulate certain ranges of motion for sporting events, or you just do really, really heavy lifting, you're probably going to get a benefit. Okay, but whilst I've just told you as much as I can to convince you that muscles are essential, I just want to remind you of a problem with just getting big, strong muscles. So for those of you who I've convinced so well that you now want to just go and do lots and lots of heavy lifting, maybe just remember, big, strong muscles have their drawbacks for high-speed movement. The first reason is because big muscles are heavy. And if we want to accelerate something fast, we're better off having a light mass. Of course, not only should you be light overall, at least as light as you can, given that you're going to need some muscle, and it's different for every sport, of course, a collision sport versus a non-collision sport, for example, but also to move our limbs really fast, we need all of the mass as close to the joints or to our midline as possible. Notice the best sprinters have big bums and big upper thigh, but not much in their calf. That's not just humans. That's all the fastest running animals that we know as well. So if you want to build a cheetah, you have to engineer your system to build the cheetah. Now, I'm very, very quickly going to just go through some of these slides. Those of you who want to re-watch this, or if you want to get some PDFs of my lecture, or you can just go straight to my sports biomechanics textbook, you can look at this in more detail. But what I just want to quickly remind you of is that we can do some simple mathematical modeling of a leg. And we can say, okay, I'm going to ask the hip to move at with a certain force or torque. And I'm going to give a 1 meter leg length, and it has a normal mass. And when it does have that mass, it has a certain moment of inertia. And if you don't know what a moment of inertia is, just think how hard it is to move. If something has a lot of inertia, it tends to stay where it is. This number won't mean much, 23. But this is the moment of inertia of our modeled limb. And what we've done is we've said, hey, if the hip is strong enough to swing it at 8 radians per second, that's a couple of 100 degrees per second, then the foot at the other end of the leg is going to move at 8 meters per second. Those of you who are in sprint running or running-based sports will know that 8 meters a second is, a very fast jog, but it's not absolutely elite. But we'll just start with that for our model. Now, let's pretend that now we're going to make our leg 5% lighter. So if we just make the whole leg a little bit lighter, this number here is therefore going to come down. The inertia comes down. And this number for velocity is going to go up. Now it comes down to 21.9, so it's a bit less. And if our inertia goes down by 5%, if everything is equal, our speed goes up by 5%, 8.4. Put that into context. If this was the last 60 meters of a 100-meter race, you'd gain 0.36 of a second. That's remarkable. Hey, but what if I had the same massive leg, like all the same amount of muscle, but all I could do is find a way to move it up the limb, closer to the hip and closer to the knee? Well, if I move it by just 2 centimeters, the number, instead of 23, is now 22. That's 3.4% less. That means I'm 3.4% faster. To put that into context, I would now gain 0.25 of a second over that last 60 meters. Again, that is quite remarkable for just moving your muscle 2 centimeters up your leg. So you'd expect then that the best runners have their mass higher in the leg. And if you thought that, you'd be right. This isn't the only study. I'll just draw your mind to sprinters 8 to 15 here because it's easy to see. This is a full MRI scan of the lower limb. And everywhere you see blue, it means that the sprinter is bigger. So the quadriceps are bigger, but the lower limb is not bigger than the average person. And if you turn them around and look at their bum and their hamstrings, they're much bigger than the average person, but their calf muscles are not. In fact, their calf muscles have sometimes got red on them. So even though these are elite athletes who need, very powerful calf muscles, some of them have lighter calf muscles than the average person. So the best sprinters have big bums and hamstrings and maybe some upper quads, but they don't necessarily have big lower limbs, as you'd expect. So just remember, if you want to build your athlete, just think not only about how much muscle mass they're allowed to have. If they're jumping upwards against gravity or they have to move fast, you're going to have to bias it towards being lighter. If you don't care because they're a forward in rugby union, or maybe they're a handball player, maybe you just add mass and it's not a problem. Then we have to think about where to add mass. Proximal in your bum and your chest, probably not a big issue. But in your forearms and your calves, it will really slow you down. Okay, so after all that, that's how strength training can really help our muscles. But I have to tell you, the bad news about this whole presentation, muscles are slow. Sarcomeres are incredibly slow. If you flexed your arm at the speed of a sarcomere, it would take you half an hour, 30 minutes just to flex your elbow. Luckily, we put lots of them in a series, all in a row. And when we do, our muscles are faster. So that's really good news, but they're still very slow. Muscles are remarkably strong though. So they've got a very high force potential. If I took your calf muscle and strung it up on a hook and electrocuted it, it could easily lift 500 kilos. Some athletes, when they're jumping and changing direction, might experience loads of 1,000 kilos and be just fine. But even though muscles are very, very strong, they are unfortunately very slow. In fact, when you jump or sprint as fast as you can, the power output of your muscles, the peak power of your muscles is less than half of the power of you jumping and sprinting. And when you throw a ball as fast as you can, the power output of the muscles in your shoulders that are helping you throw is probably only 10 or 20% of the power output of your throw. So we have missing power from nowhere. The muscles are not powerful enough to drive human performance. So where do we get power from? If we don't know that, how are we supposed to improve it? Well, there's two things we need to know. First of all, technique. This is a throw. Okay, not a great thrower. This is me trying to throw slowly enough to show you that the hip doesn't ever move that fast. Look, that's its velocity. Whereas the fingers and hands move much, much faster. And notice they move in a sequence. Notice that the pattern is hip to shoulder to elbow to fingers. This proximal to distal sequencing, which is characteristic of a throw. And by the way, a kick is just a throw. Proximal distal timing. This is that kinetic chain thing they talk about. And what that does is transfers energy from the big proximal muscles down towards our very light lower limbs, our feet and our fingers. And when all that energy gets to a very light thing, like our hands or our feet, they move very fast. It's just pure physics. Again, you can read all about yourself, or you can ask me later on, but just be aware that your technique really, really matters. But it's not just that. This is a vertical jump. Okay, so if we put an ultrasound device on your calf muscle, just where it meets the Achilles tendon, and then use some video cameras to record your movement, what we can figure out is that when you do the first part of your jump, so this is, by the way, this is just a static or squat jump. So it's not a dip and jump. You just squat in position and then jump straight up. So it's concentric movement only. And remember, it's a throw-like pattern because anything for speed is throw-like. So your upper body goes up first well before your lower body and your ankle. Your ankle is the last thing to move. So if we look at your calf muscle, the whole muscle tendon unit doesn't change length much early in the movement because your hips and your knees are extending. And then late in the movement, when you're at the highest speed phase of your jump, of course, your calf muscles and your Achilles tendon are shortening very, very rapidly. So does that mean the muscle is doing nothing? Your calf muscle isn't doing anything? I mean, in a vertical jump, your ankle is the most powerful part of the jump. Well, no, because the fibers or the fascicles are shortening. And they're doing that by stretching the tendon. So the ankle isn't doing anything because as the muscles generate a force, the tendons are being stretched and they're storing energy. And then in this big shortening of the whole muscle tendon unit in your calf muscle, the muscle is almost isometric. It's if you believed in specificity of training, you would literally have to train isometrically because this is where the calf muscle is doing its fastest movement. How is it doing it? Well, it's doing it because the Achilles tendon is recoiling rapidly. So even in any fast movement that you do, your muscle does work stretching the tendon. The muscles are quite slow at it. But when the tendons then recoil, they are infinitely faster. In fact, in something like sprint running, your tendon, your Achilles tendon will recoil more than twice as fast as your muscle will ever shorten. So if we look at your whole muscle tendon unit stretching and then shortening during the propulsion phase, the muscle only stretches the tiniest bit and only actually shortens with a low power. So where does the power output come from if the muscle barely stretches and then doesn't shorten with much power? The tendon. The tendon stretches a lot with negative power to store energy and then shortens with a lot of propulsive power to give you that energy back. And it gives you that energy back slow. Look how long it takes to stretch and then boom, shorten. So tendons are really important. So does that mean we can manipulate the tendon? I mean, is the point of strength training then to change the tendon as much as it is to change the muscles? Well, the answer is yes, because we need a stiff tendon, because under a big force, it may not stretch far, but it does something else. Sorry, back to my physics. I love physics. Everyone loves maths, right? We all love maths. What type of tendon do you need? Well, we can ask Isaac Newton because Isaac Newton would say, well, any tendon that generates a high force. Because if you want to take a mass and accelerate it to a high speed, you need a big force. So what type of tendon gives us a big force? Well, we can ask his contemporary, Robert Hooke, because Robert Hooke found a solution that any spring generates a force that is proportional to how stiff it is and how far you can stretch it. So if you can stretch a stiff tendon, if you're strong enough in your muscles to stretch a stiffer tendon, you'll get a much bigger recoil force to accelerate any load rapidly. I just remind you here, it's not just about stiffness, but for energy stored. And energy stored requires K, that's stiffness, and X, that's elongation. So stretching, it matters. So we need stiff tendons if we want to move fast, as long as we're strong enough, okay? How do we get stiff tendons? Well, to the best of our knowledge, heavy strength training increases force of the muscle and stiffness of our tendons. And we know that at least in the Achilles tendon and patella tendon, Achilles, patella tendon in humans. More so than sprint training and plyometrics training, heavy strength training gives us stiffer tendons and, of course, more contractile strength in our muscles. This might be a really important mechanism by which heavy stuff in which we move slow may actually also benefit us moving fast. But I do just want to finish on one slide that I think is really, really useful. And that is that plyometrics training and other types of speed training can still be important. They're still resistance exercise, and they can still stiffen tendons a bit. So in this study done by a Japanese group with Yasuo Kawakami, did a whole bunch of plyometrics training, and they did find that the Achilles tendon stiffness went up. In this case, from 193 to 260. Won't mean much to you, but That's a pretty big number difference, isn't it? And they did this by doing lots of drop jump training. And then they measured how they did a drop jump at the end of it. And what's important here is not just that the tendon got stiffer like I said it should. What happens when you do this type of training is that your whole neuromuscular system alters the way it behaves. You move differently. Before the training, the ankle joint would change quickly as soon as you hit the ground, but take a long time to extend. After the training, it shortened and extended in approximately equal times. There is a symmetry to this, just like a bouncing ball has a symmetry when it bounces and squashes back up off the ground. This, of course, is associated with a change in the angular velocity from here to here. So, of course, the ankle moved faster. And as I said, when you're jumping, the ankle is key. And it's the same when you run or walk. The ankle is dominant. Now, the force at the foot, again, you can see quick as they land on the ground, a fair wobble here. It takes a while to know what they're doing, and then they come off the ground. Afterwards, again, a bigger force, but notice that symmetry, again, like a bouncing ball symmetry. But here's the really interesting thing. At the muscle tendon level, before training, what happens here is that as they land, the muscle shortens a fraction to take up some of the slack, but then the muscle itself stretches and has to shorten. Whereas after training, the muscle shortens fractionally to take up the slack and remains almost isometric. It doesn't stretch and shorten. It just does a little shortening at the end to provide a bit extra power. So the muscle then holds relatively stiff now rather than getting stretched under the load and then having to shorten. And therefore, that allows the tendon, which kind of stretched and then slowly recoiled, to stretch faster and further and recoil faster. So now we see that the plyometrics training, which led to extra strength and extra stiffness in the tendon, allowed the muscle to remain more isometric and allowed the tendon to stretch and recoil faster. And this is where the power really comes from. And some of that improvement comes from the nervous system. You can see that when they first land on the ground here, lots of EMG, and then kind of this period of silence. That's all your inhibitory reflexes kicking in to stop you producing force. That's not ideal. Look, after training, almost no inhibitory signal and just full activation. And so the nervous system learned to move fast. And I think this is a really cool study to show how important it is to load intensely, in this case, plyometrics training. So if I'm to summarize then, I'd say that high speed movement requires an optimum output from the nervous system and the muscles, but it is driven almost predominantly by the recoil of the elastic tissues like our tendon, because muscles are too slow. So how do we get the contractile capacity and the contractile speed to load those tendons appropriately? Well, forms of resistance training or strength training, including very heavy training where we might move very slowly, seem to be really useful for moving fast. So that means in your programs, you'll have to integrate different forms of resistance training, from really heavy, slow stuff to the faster, unloaded stuff like plyometrics, calisthenics, and these sorts of things, overspeed training. And of course, muscles even at different joints. You know, in the sprinter, the hip and the ankle are key, for example. Different joints have different jobs, different functions. And so you're going to have to train even each joint slightly differently. But in the end, I just want to take you back to the start. High speed training really is the key. So I'm not trying to say get in the gym and lift heavy and all your worlds will, the seas will part and everything will be amazing. But strength training, even including the heavy, slow stuff, even if your force velocity profile says, hey, you need to be faster, there can be real benefits to loading the body heavy if you want to move fast. I really appreciate the chance to chat to you about this sort of stuff. I'm very happy to take any questions you might have.
Very, very, very good presentation. The content is very good, but the presenter is better than So I will give some time to the those who have been assisting this presentation to make some questions, and I have one. I also have my questions, but I will give the time first to those who were watching. So João Roquete asked, in golf, the swing speed is one important factor for the distance we can throw the ball, but it's difficult to design representative tasks in the gym or in the field for resistance training, plyometrics training, and rate of force development. What do you recommend for specific development of swing speed in golf training, including in older golfers, which lose swing speed with the age?
Yes. So first of all, I am not a golf expert, but if you break down the golf swing, you realize that all of the power from the golf swing comes from the ground reaction force. Your legs produce a force against the ground. That force comes back up into you. That's where all the energy comes from. So one of the problems with golfers is that they often are in the gym doing all their swing training without realizing that their leg strength is really important. And in older golfers, leg strength becomes a real problem. So doing quarter squats and, short range of motion, heavy leg presses could be very beneficial. The second thing about the golf swing is that it is a throw-like pattern. So it's that sequential pattern that is absolutely essential. So technique is key. And what a lot of golfers don't notice is the incredible wrist release that is required. And therefore, it may be necessary to make sure that grip strength and wrist strength is actually there, so that when the whole body swings hard, the wrist can deal with the massive forces that go through it. So without giving you a very long overview of the golf swing biomechanics and how to train it, I would give you the three: leg strength, rotation, range of motion, and wrist and finger strength and range of motion. Try those and see how it works.
Great. So I have no questions from the audience, but I have one question, personal question. We know that in some sports, in team sports, for instance, like football, having power is critical for some athletes, but keeping those power at high levels, it's critical. So which training methodology you would advise to increase the endurance of power capacity?
Okay, so the first thing I have to say is, of course, you have your athlete who has strengths and weaknesses, and then they have position-specific things that you're trying to achieve. So I can't tell you exactly how to train every football player, but the first thing I will say is technique is the key. So the one thing that most coaches and strength and conditioning people don't do is teach people how to run. That includes how to fall, how to move center of gravity during running and change of direction, how to keep limbs in the appropriate positions for running. Luckily, some of the top footballers in the world have reasonably good running mechanics. So I would say that the biggest problem I see in strength and conditioning for football players is the lack of specific task practice. Change of direction, acceleration, and believe it or not, top speed running. And just on that little argument that everyone has, oh, soccer athletes never run further than 30 or 40 meters, so I won't do it in training. That's specificity of training, which I don't believe in. If you think about specificity of the adaptations, first of all, soccer players are often accelerating while they're already moving. So they do hit a reasonably high speed pretty often. But second of all, you've got to practice running fast. And if you only let yourself run 30 meters, you don't get a lot of practice. Whereas if you let yourself run for 100 meters or 120 meters, you have a lot of footfalls where you're practicing the movement skill. You may not do that a lot in the season, but you still need to do it maybe once a week in season, just for 1 or 2 repetitions. The second thing I will say is that there will be a benefit to soccer players for doing very brief workouts in the gym, because of course there's a lot of football to be played. But in those brief workouts, intensity would be the key. So you would never go to fatigue in the gym, just like we wouldn't for a kayaker, a rower, a cyclist. But you can do very heavy stuff for just a few reps, and you can do explosive stuff for just a few reps. And this is why it's great to get them into it when they're young, because if their technique is good, then they could train in the gym twice a week. They can do a few very heavy reps and a few explosive reps to get both aspects of it. They can keep their training short, and they can do it without risk of injury and without getting sore. If you only train in the gym once a week, you get sore, and then that affects everything. So I would say being regular in the gym, high intensity but low fatigue, and proper mechanics training would be probably, in my short answer, the keys to football training.
Okay, great. Last question. You have mentioned the importance of tendon properties to be a powerful person. Stiffness is important and elongation capacity as well. What about the property of tendons to restore the energy and keep it, and when he release, come back? So what about hysteresis?
Yeah, so what's interesting is, so for those of you who aren't sure, if you deform anything, so if you have a tendon and you stretch it, when it recoils, not all the energy comes back out because some of it was already lost. And the energy lost is the hysteresis. And obviously you don't want to lose energy, so you want low hysteresis. Now, the good thing is that to the best of our knowledge, it's not easy to measure in humans, but in our animal data, it looks like tendons have a very good hysteresis. In a very low. In animal data, human data, because it's so hard to measure, it's hard to know what to believe. But in the few studies that are out there, I think there is some evidence that maybe plyometrics training, maybe flexibility training could have some small benefit for hysteresis. I've seen no evidence that strength training would do that. But of course, if you have a stiffer tendon, but you can still stretch it a long way, you'll store more energy. And in the end, the big benefit of that will swamp the potentially very small change in hysteresis. I mean, if we're losing less than 10% of energy and you can improve that by 20%, you're only getting 2% more energy back out. But if you can stretch the tendon 3 millimeters further and it was stiffer, then you might end up getting 15 to 20% more energy back out. So there is more benefit from focusing on stretching it and stiffening it than there is from reducing the hysteresis, at least based on our current evidence.
Okay, great. Professor Anthony Blazevich, was a very big pleasure for our faculty and for the Congress to have your presentation, and at a big distance in the other side of the planet, your presence. Okay. Thank you so much, and I will conclude this presentation, this session.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to you all. Enjoy the rest of your conference.
Okay. Thank you.